Before I get on to a few questions, just a message to our participants. Please look out for the online polls while the discussion is going on and respond to them when they appear. They will stay on your screen just for a minute, so you have to be quick in responding. So I will start off with a round of questions to the panel, first of all, and then I'll pick up some questions from the audience as well. Let me turn to you first, Dhara. When you look at the public sector today, there appears to be a large number of institutions which have similar overlapping functions. Do you think it is critically important to rationalize this institutional framework after carrying out a proper detailed study in order to improve the efficiency of service delivery?
Yes, I think that would be a pretty sensible thing to do in the current circumstances in particular, because we do have, I don't know whether any kind of assessment about to identify overlapping has been done in the recent past, but we seem to be adding more and more departments, and now Mr. Attygalle spoke of 3 or 4 or 5 others that are going to be established. So I don't know whether we have, in establishing those, looked at who has been performing that function previously. Do they deserve to exist any further? I don't know whether that kind of, I believe they did. I mean, it would not be the wisest thing to establish new institutions without looking at what is expected of them. So I think what we need to remember is all of these institutions, all of the ministries, all of the departments exist to serve the people, to provide some outcome that will benefit and contribute to improve the quality of life of the people. No institution or ministry or department that does not contribute to that ultimate objective deserves to exist. So I won't elaborate because I do know, I did realize that we are short of time. So yes, a critical evaluation and assessment of all of the institutions is absolutely necessary. And in each case, the question to be asked is, why does it exist? Does it contribute to the ultimate objectives of government? Do they perform a useful service? For example, we have a whole lot of science research institutes. Do they all provide a proper service? Do they deserve to exist? The question that needs to be asked is the funding given by government, and particularly now critical point in time where we have to manage our resources, financial resources, human resources, and natural resources very intelligently, are they useful to people? Should you minimize the numbers so that people also need to access like one institution to have their services to satisfy their needs? So my response to you is yes, that kind of an assessment is critically important.
Thank you, Dhara. Let me now shift on to state-owned enterprises, and just to begin the dialogue on that topic, ask Roshan, why is it so important to pay so much of attention to SOEs?
Thank you, Manjula. I think firstly, what we need to realize is that the state-owned enterprises are some of the largest corporates in this country. In fact, if you take the 50 SOEs that are monitored, 52 SOEs, I think mentioned by Mr. Attygalle by the Ministry of Finance, the total turnover of these SOEs amount to about 14% of GDP. And to just put it into perspective, I think the whole export sector accounts for the same amount. So it's 14% of GDP. And in fact, there are some SOEs with higher turnover of even some of our, by multiples actually, than some of these largest corporates that we have in the country, or largest private sector corporates. Secondly, these SOEs are the main providers of infrastructure and public services, such as energy, transport, water, etc. And as I think Mr. Attygalle mentioned again, they operate in underserved areas that would not be undertaken by the private sector. And I think he gave us examples. I mean, the road, the public, I think Tan Sri mentioned about public transport. And I think that is one area that the government operates in because it would not be undertaken by the private sector. And it is also one of the levers used by government for development. But I think what I want to focus on is another area where we need to pay attention to this sector, because the operations of these entities have implications both for the macroeconomy as well as the productivity of the economy. And to put this in some concrete terms, every year the SOEs have been making losses. And in 2019, which is what we have data for the whole year, the losses were about 150 billion. This is of the enterprises that are monitored by the MOF. And to put that into context, it amounted to about 80% of the government's health expenditure in the same year. So this has implications for the fiscal sector, because the losses are financed through borrowings, which are usually guaranteed by the Treasury, and hence are contingent liabilities of the government. And also some of this debt lies on the balance sheets of the banks, which then have implications for the financial sector and financial stability. So for those reasons, I think it is important that SOEs are managed properly, so that they are not a burden to the fiscal, but more importantly, that they make a productive contribution to the economy.
Thanks, Roshan. If I may bring you in now at this point, Malathy, what are the challenges posed by principal-agent dynamics to the management of state enterprises? How can these be overcome in the best interest of the general public?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go on.
All right. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to break your question up. Thank you, Manju, into 3 bits. What is the principal agent problem, and how is that relevant to SOEs, and the challenges faced by this, particularly in terms of public service obligations in SOEs, and what we can do about it. So very quickly, to the audience that may not be very familiar with all these technicalities, the principal agent problem is when there is a divergence or misalignment of incentives and interests between an owner and an agent that is authorized to act on behalf of the owner. Now, when you take a private company, you have the shareholders and you have the management. In a state-owned enterprise, there's a double agency problem, right? You have politicians and managers, and then you have the owners or the public. And invariably, there's a collective action problem where they can't hold people accountable. It's very difficult for the public to do that. So that basically ends up in accountability lapses, lack of transparency, informational asymmetries, leading to, say, quality and cost issues. Now, the challenges is basically the same thing of management issues, and what can we do about it? I'm a little skeptical about having solutions that are only within the government. This is why I'd like to lead into, I think, what Dumith is going to talk about. I mean, it's not a state versus market solution. Both have to work together. But if you have something like, we've had various solutions over time. We've had SEMA, we have had SRMC, and it really hasn't worked to crack this principal agent problem. So I believe that having a group of SOEs which are not tradable, but that are in the stock market, they are forced to be visible. Okay, so that's, I think Dumith will take that on. The second one is imposing competitive neutrality. Under our competition law, the little bit that we do have, which is anti-competitive practices, both state enterprises and state-owned SOEs and the private sector come under that law. So this is something that we can do. So I'm going to leave it at that right now because I think we're running out of time, and I'll come back and answer anything that anyone might have based on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Malathy. Yes, that really sets the tone for my next question, which I'm going to direct at Dumith. There are many who advocate that listing of state enterprises on the stock exchange will be beneficial, even if they continue to be substantially owned by the state, that there is no real need for a significant stake to be passed on to the private sector. Can you elaborate on how this will help, and also what measures you are willing to introduce from the stock exchange to encourage such listings, for instance, by creating a special board for SOEs, and what are the other steps that can be taken.
Thank you, Manjula, and thank you for having me here. I think, like ST Attygalle, I'll go back to the President's manifesto to actually reach out to what can set the tone here, because at the end of the day, the state has to be satisfied with any solution for state-owned enterprises. In the President's manifesto, very clearly, it states that there will be no privatization. It also states that there will be a strong focus on state-owned enterprises, both in terms of professional management, in terms of finding apolitical, career-oriented professional managers, and it goes to the extent of talking about compensation and remuneration models that will incentivize people to join, the best people to join SOEs. It also talks about the transparency, because it specifically, and I was surprised that the manifesto went into this kind of detail. It talks about timely filing of annual reports, which I think is very progressive, and also performance management. And the third piece, I think that was quite interesting about it is the willingness to, or the desire to move state-owned enterprises into very competitive positions vis-a-vis private sector companies and running these to international standards. So it begs the question, how do you achieve this? And I think Malathy pointed out very clearly that history has taught us, not just in Sri Lanka, but in many other markets, that keeping these companies entirely within a government structure is not necessarily conducive to achieving those objectives. So I think the critical thing I would say here is that listing offers that opportunity where listing is not incompatible with government control. Listing is something that can be done hand in hand with government control. And there are four stakeholders I think you need to think about with the SOEs. Clearly one, as Malathy pointed out, is your ultimate shareholder, which is the public. Secondly, you have the government who manages these. Then third, you have the staff of these entities. And finally, you actually have the customers, the people who receive the services of these state-owned enterprises. So I can go through how a listing can benefit each of those stakeholders, but I'll focus on one or two of them. I think primarily for the public, as Malathy pointed out, I think the accountability and the transparency that you can get out of a listing process can be definitely value added. From the government's perspective, there are two or three critical areas of benefit. One is in a situation where the government needs to grow these companies, I think you need to understand the value of capital. I'll give you an example in the banking sector. The state banks 20 years ago had about 53% of assets of the banking sector. Today, it's fallen down to about 40%. Under Basel III capital requirements, huge amounts of capital will be required to grow the banking sector. And clearly, with the current fiscal situation, I don't think it would be feasible to be continuously tapping into treasury funds to do that. So it's an opportunity to tap into public funds, maintain government control, maintain the objectives, the societal objectives that the ST talked about, and make sure that those are also implemented through these entities. But back to your question, I think, as a stock exchange, I think we take the approach, a pragmatic approach of actually trying to be, what we want to be is a solution provider to the government, not to dictate terms on how anyone lists on the exchange. So we absolutely would be quite open to creating new and flexible ways to do this. I think we just, in fact, yesterday passed rules to enable debentures offered by SOEs to fall under a different framework to that of corporate debentures. We would be quite willing to look at some of the governance requirements and how to make that compatible with the government's needs. We would also be quite open to looking at lifting the current limit on non-voting shares. So at the moment, non-voting shares can only be a 15% cap on total shares outstanding. But we could consider lifting that cap so that the government can list more non-voting shares. So economic interests are handed out. Capital to grow can be raised from the public. but where the ownership control does not get diluted at all. So those are a few ways in which we can approach this.
Thank you, Dumith. Yes, certainly. I also feel that we may have to change the structure, for listing, if you have to accommodate some of the state-owned enterprises and to make it easier for their entry into the market. There are a few questions that have come from the audience, which I will take on now. Let me start with a question to ST, since ST spoke a lot on the budget and emphasized on the importance of the budget as a tool for resource allocation. So there's a question to you. What are the steps that your office will be taking to monitor and drive the implementation of the budget? Are the revenue targets being monitored on an ongoing basis? Is there a process in place to enable this?
Yeah, the first question is about the budget implementation of the budget. Normal practice has been if you take, say, X amount of proposals, few proposals are only implemented. So that is not a good sign. I think that's why this question comes also. What we are planning is, we have already started now for 2021 budget. We have already started activities, and we are waiting till the Parliament approves the budget on the 10th. First, one thing is about the subsidies that has been subsidies, interest subsidies and things, that we can fast track those things. Also, we have been working with the Inland Revenue, etc., to do the necessary adjustments in the tax laws. We are doing the drafting, so to be ready by next year, January itself. And also I'm planning to have a separate unit this time in the Treasury to monitor this. We have listed all the activities now, and we will be working on that. So you all have to gauge that only after 1 year, right? So for that. Then the other one about the revenue, yes, we are monitoring. We are continuously monitoring the revenue. I think I mentioned about the numbers also. So that's happening, right? And just to comment on Dhara's comment about having new entities, etc. If you go through the budget, Dhara, they are specifically, we have mentioned, the finance minister has mentioned that he is going to merge certain institutions which are doing the same thing as you mentioned, and certain institutions have been identified also. Apart from that, there are certain other institutions that we can merge, and he has mentioned about, specifically if you talk about the tourism side, he has mentioned coconut industry, he has mentioned. Then the what is this about, again, in your subject, the science and technology side, all the what are those called, entities like ITI, the research institutes to be brought under one umbrella. So those things have been clearly mentioned in the budget, and the institutions that I talked about, or the entities that we are going to start, those are in a way, yes, they will be new entities coming under me or the ST, but those are not the normal stuff, right? Because we didn't have anything to say like giving investment, what is this called, investment approvals, that type of thing we haven't done in an institutional setup. So that's why we are talking about these 4 companies, where it will be more or less like operating like a private entity with full autonomy. So those are new, but I think something special, not the norm.
Thanks, Sajith, for that response. And let me pose a question to Tan Sri. Again, a question that has come from the audience. As program management was a key success factor, how do you enhance the program management capacity? And what were the standards of best practice promoted during your tenure?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think as shown in there, the capacity building in terms of program management, but also other practices was, had to be done concurrently with the actual execution. And often this task is not seen by people outside. So we invested quite heavily into the right people, actually. So as mentioned, the policies around hiring as well as the compensation, etc. And there was an element that I was able to attract, many Malaysians, many who were working abroad to come back as a bit of a national call. And Sri Lanka also has a large, I think, professional diaspora. And many of them were specialists in the field of program management or corporate restructuring or M&A, the kind of skills that were required during that phase. We also work with a whole host of consultancy firms and studying whatever best practices, but adapted to the local condition. So I hope that answers. I mean, if you're interested, there's a whole bunch of literature that we can share that has been put into manuals and documents. I can get a set over, and I think Dr. Hans is probably quite familiar with them as well.
Thanks, Tan Sri, and appreciate all of you keeping your answers brief, so that gives me the opportunity to take up more questions. So let me put a question back to Dhara again. Having been engaged in some previous attempts to introduce a robust performance management framework for the public sector during the time that you served as a secretary to several ministries, what will you consider as the most important factors that will help to make the public service more efficient?
I believe that the public service can I be heard? Yeah. I believe that the public service needs to focus on achieving results, very importantly, because we have a tendency to monitor outputs. Ministry is given an allocation, and then you're judged by how much of that is spent at the end of that year. Moving from there to identifying objectives, targets, and measuring outcomes will be vital. And I'm not going to elaborate too much because I do know we have only 10 minutes left, but that requires every ministry and department to be told how they can contribute to the objectives that are identified for them. And what is required, importantly, would be to measure the performance, not merely look at whether the money has been spent, but whether that money that has been spent has achieved the desired development objective that was identified for them. That is key. So this means this involves evaluating is what we are doing, is what the ministry or department or institution is doing, contributing effectively and efficiently, or should you, an evaluation will tell you whether what you're doing is necessary to be continued or not necessary to be continued. So you need to make that judgment call based on absolute evidence. That is, evidence-based decision-making is very necessary. I have a lot more to say on this, but Manjula, I'm going to stop there because I do realize that you have a lot more questions as well, but I'll be happy to answer more questions.
Thanks, Dhara. No, that's very helpful. And in fact, performance management is not only important for the core of the government, but it's equally important to the state-owned enterprises as well. And so is corporate governance. Let me turn to Malathy and ask you, what are the alternate policy options available to improve both corporate governance and performance management in state enterprises?
Okay, so again, back to the context very quickly. Right now, we are in a COVID economy. And while as Roshan has emphasized, there is a crying need for fiscal consolidation. SOEs are unique in that they also have to provide socio-economic obligations, and there is also political pressure. So widespread reform is not possible. And at the same time, there are huge range of, not a huge, perhaps in the literature there's a huge range, but in Sri Lanka, there is a menu of options that we can draw from. So if I would, some examples here, hold on. Okay, so I'm going to look at two examples where divestiture actually worked and where it didn't, right? Look at LMS and SLIC in Sri Lanka, but it was reversed by the Supreme Court. Conditions were not in place and it didn't work properly because the regulatory regime was not in place. You take Sri Lanka Telecom, they had the sequencing right. Before privatization, there was contestability because the wireless loop operators were in place in the fixed sector. In the mobile sector, there was dynamic competition. There was at that time an independent regulator with those conditions, and then they went for privatization. And the results were that it was win-win. Waiting lists fell, costs fell. Basically, we are in this situation right now with respect to telephony because it was structured and the conditions, initial conditions were. But we don't have, we have to face the fact that we're not in that kind of a position right now. So looking to other options, China, for instance, has used corporatization, which is having the internal governance structures almost like, I mean, they have state capitalism, right? So the market discipline is in place. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, as Dhara was talking about performance contracting at the top level, we had those IMF SCIs, okay, for five state-owned enterprises, and that can be replicated right through the entity at every single level. Third thing, and this is the one that I think is the most important, is competition. Ring fencing, unbundling, and competition. It doesn't have to be ownership change. You take CB, okay, you take, okay, so transmission is a natural monopoly, but distribution is not a monopoly. And in 2002, there were measures in place to have four or five, I'm not sure, distribution companies that would compete. They were called discos at that time. So there are, and look at our banking sector. I think Roshan knows more about this and I'd probably like her to pitch in, but the state banking sector, there is, I mean, they're not performing as well as the private banks because they also have to keep debts from other SOEs in place, but they're doing relatively better than the others. Not going to talk about the holding company versus advisory agency because I think my distinguished fellow colleague from Kazana spoke about it, except to make one comment. I don't think we're quite ready for an ownership agency at this point in time. And I fear that we will end up like Bhutan, where the Druk holdings completely fell apart because institutional structures within government are not strong enough. But we are ready for something like an advisory body, which will, or a supervisory body that will basically at interim stage supervise, manage all SOEs until we get to the stage where we're ready for a holding company. Thank you.
Thanks, Malathy. Just a final question I would like to put to Roshan. Very quickly, if you can respond. We often pay a lot of attention to the fiscal burden created on the treasury by SOEs. But when you analyze the numbers, you find that over 90% of the losses are generated by just a handful of entities. So therefore, and at the same time, there are many SOEs which are also profitable. So at the enterprise level, do you think we need a two-pronged approach? A quick response from you will help to conclude the session on time.
Yes, that's correct, actually, because there are just three enterprises, that is CPC, CEB, and SLA, that account for 90% of those losses. But I just, at this point, I don't want to only focus on the fiscal risks, but also I want to talk about the impact that they have on the overall productivity of the economy, because the output from these key SOEs are major inputs into the other sectors of the economy. So therefore, improving the productivity and efficiency of those SOEs will have a positive contribution to the rest of the productivity and growth of the entire sector. And one more thing I want to add is, I think ST talked about all the infrastructure gaps that we have in the country and how the budget had allocated resources towards it. But what we have to be mindful is we are resource constrained. So what is important is to ensure that whatever investments are made in infrastructure are made more efficiently, so that you can get more out of less investment. And that for this, we require really strong institutions and governance within these SOEs, which will be doing the public investment to ensure that they make a positive contribution to growth. I think yesterday, the speaker from Vietnam emphasized the importance of infrastructure to attract FDI. So I think this is an area that we really need to focus on.
Thanks, Roshan. So on that note, I think we will bring the session to a close. So thank you very much back again to the speakers, Tan Sri joining from Malaysia, and the ST joining us in spite of a very busy schedule, and also the rest of the panel, Dumith, Malathy, Roshan, and Dhara. Thank you very much.